Good evening. We are so happy that we are together today for the PSC Partners Roadmap Drug Development 101 meeting. Our pursuit of a cure for PSC patients as pillars of clinical trials. My name is Mary Villas. I'm the president of PSC Partners Canada. And it is very exciting that so many are joining us this December evening. I welcome everybody, including our keynote speaker and breakout room co-facilitators. Before we get started with this Roadmap 101, I'd like to briefly review what the Roadmap initiative is all about. Roadmap is one outcome of work that has been ongoing over the past few years. This includes the receipt of the CZI Rare as One grant. A primary goal of this grant is to leverage the power of patients to accelerate PSC research, including the development of a patient-organized collaborative research network. The October 2020 PFDD meeting on PSC with the FDA, and thirdly, the PSC Partners Patient Registry, which currently has over 2,000 participants from around the world. Together, this work has led to expanding the vision of the role of PSC partners and the PSC patient community in research and drug development. Next slide, please. With that bit of context, let's revisit the goals of Roadmap, which are accelerating progress to find therapies and a cure by 1, educating the patient community on the research landscape, 2, broadening the researcher base and strengthening multi-stakeholder communication, and 3, creating opportunities for researchers and clinicians to engage in meaningful discussions with an informed patient community. Next slide, please. Practically, what does this mean? Hopefully, you've seen this roadmap graphic, which to the right shows the 3 main stakeholders, and on the left shows the 4 topic areas as steps. We're now starting we're on the 3rd step. The topic is drug development. For each of these topics, we're hosting a series of meetings with 2 or more Zoom meetings per topic. The 101 sessions like tonight are community focused and educational, and the 201 plus sessions are multi-stakeholder discussions. Next slide, please. Thank you so much again for joining us and welcome. Now I will pass the Zoom mic to Joanne Hatchett, Medical Science Liaison of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to all of tonight's participants, both first-timers and repeat attendees. Drug Development 101 is exciting and will lead us into additional discussions in January. Tonight, we'll begin with our keynote speaker, Frank Sasinowski, and then we have the privilege of meeting with our excellent co-facilitators in the breakout rooms to answer PSC patients and caregivers questions about drug development and clinical trials, as well as to listen to and discuss your comments and/or concerns about clinical trials. We are honored to have our breakout co-facilitators, Drs. Elaine Chen, Chu Hong Chung, Bertus Eckstein, Aparna Goel, Eric Lefebvre, Edward Manna, Tamir Milo, Dan Pratt, Steve Rossi, Frank Sasinowski, and Sujal Shah. Next slide. During the general session, closed captioning live transcript is available. To turn it on, go to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please mute your mic and turn off your video during the general session. Tonight, instead of using the chat, we ask that you jot down your questions on your own, save them so that you can ask them during the breakout room. Remember, breakout room sessions are a time to get your questions answered. Please do your best to make your questions as succinct as possible. And remember, this is not a time to ask for personal advice. We encourage you to turn your video on during the breakout room. A PSC moderator will open the breakout room and our co-facilitators will guide the discussion and ask for your questions and comments. These discussions will not be recorded, but there will be a PSC community note taker taking notes for internal use only. All comments will be de-identified and confidentiality will be maintained. And now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Frank Sasinowski, who has assisted sponsors and patient organizations in developing new medicines and has helped secure FDA approval for hundreds of new drugs, mainly for serious and rare diseases. His love of science has led to degrees in genetics, physiology, nutrition, and public health. He worked for the FDA for several years before joining his current law firm. The National Organization for Rare Diseases has awarded Frank the first ever Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as Pope Francis earlier this year presented his 2021 Pontifical Hero Award for Inspiration for Frank's passionate advocacy for those with rare diseases. Thank you, and over to you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And it is my real pleasure to be with you. I spent today in an advisory committee at the FDA on a rare kidney disease therapy. And I really have to say that being with you is kind of the wind beneath my wings. So thank you for allowing me to be with you tonight. So I'm going to talk about what I've been asked by PSC partners to talk about is, drug development. And so the first half of my talk, I'm going to talk in general about what does that mean? And then the second half, I'm going to turn to you, patients, and talk about your role. Next slide. So the first half is just talking about drug development and the role of the FDA. So next slide, please. So drug discovery, I mean, typically, drug discovery happens in lots of different ways. We're going to hear in your breakout session, you're going to have an expert from academia, probably, and researchers all over the country focus on rare diseases. You'd be surprised at how often researchers around the world are focused on rare diseases like yours. So there are many different ways that that people come into the discovery process. And once researchers identify a promising compound, they start following a well-established path to look to see that they're safe and effective before they reach the public. Next slide, please. So the first thing is that when you have this promising compound, you first go off and do some work in animals. I know that kind of bothers some people that we expose animals to risk, but we have to find out, what are the profiles, the toxicology is what we call it, of the compounds. We can only look inside an animal, for instance, after they've been exposed to a new compound. When they're then sacrificed, we can dissect all their different organs and tissues. That sounds messy. But what we can do is look under a microscope for preclinical signs of lesions, so we know whether there's any harm being done to any tissues or organs. We can't do that with humans, even when we put them in trials later. And the other thing that animals are really wonderful for is being able to be animal models of the disease that we're looking at. So we can see whether or not there's what's called target engagement, whether or not the compound is actually having the impact on the physiologic mechanisms that might have an impact on our condition that we're studying. Next slide, please. So the end of, after you're done with all that animal work, then a researcher or a company will then go to the FDA and ask to open what's called an IND. And an IND means it's FDA's permission to allow you to go forward and start your first in human trials. And those first in human trials are called phase 1. You're primarily, looking at the safety of the compound. And if you can, you are also trying to get some idea of whether or not there's maybe even some signs, early signs of biomarkers, some signs of activity. One thing that I didn't list on here is that in addition to looking at the, in the IND submission, the FDA looks at pharmacology, toxicology, looks at the chemistry and manufacturing. They look at, of course, the protocol, which is the design. What is the researcher proposing to do in the study? And they look at the information on the investigator to make sure they're qualified. But the thing I didn't put on the slide I looked at later is there's also a role for informed consent. The FDA has rules on two things: informed consent to try to make sure that you, the patient, are going to be adequately apprised of the information and all the risks associated with this compound. The other thing is that there's institutional review boards, that at every academic institution or others, there's going to be something called this IRB, and that's made up of a group of people who are going to look at it like from the community and see whether or not the kind of information that is going to be disclosed to you is going to be appropriate and that your safety is going to be guaranteed. So I just want to kind of give you an overview of all the safeguards and all the different parts of this process. Next slide, please. So then we get into, after you're through the first in human trials, the phase 1, looking at basic safety, then you go into phase 2, the next stage. And what you're looking at is trying to find the right dose, because in phase 1, you're not really looking at any kind of treatment benefit. So now you're starting to look at signs of treatment benefit, even early markers of treatment benefit, so you can pick the right dose. And you might have heard sometimes people call these proof of concept studies. So maybe that's something, a phrase that you've heard. And then once you do that and you have a dose picked out, you've got hopefully some sort of endpoints, some sort of measures of the disease or process that it hopefully is going to be ameliorated or completely abated, completely stopped. Then at that point, you're ready to go into a full-blown, what we call pivotal registration trial. Next slide, please. And that's called the phase 3 trials. Now, I call these, this is out of the FDA IND regulations. I was at FDA in the mid-'80s when they got massively rewritten. There was a guy, Steve Unger, who did this IND rewrite. And we called this, at those days, we didn't even know about rare diseases, hardly in those days. And so we called this phase 3, we saw it's a large scale. Now, everything Einstein taught us is relative in the cosmos. And so when we talk about large scale, I mean, the big trial that was being discussed today in the advisory committee for this rare disease, this rare kidney disease, had a total enrollment of about 200 people with Alport syndrome. And so when we say large scale, it's relative to the size of the population. And by the way, I should say something to PSC partners, and that is this. You know, at the FDA, they pay attention to what patient organizations put out on their websites. And when you put out on the website that there's an estimated 30,000 people, you know, in the United States with PSC, the FDA immediately thinks, well, you know, maybe you can enroll about 10% of that in trials. So they're thinking you might be able to enroll 3,000 subjects in a trial. Now, so I'm just cautioning you that when you talk to the FDA, it's one thing to have on your website, you estimate there's 30,000, but the only people can enroll in a study are going to be those who are diagnosed, who are identified as having PSC. So you ought to be ready to have on your website or when you talk to the FDA, what is the real number of the actual number of people that could participate in the trial? And I'm sure that number is much fewer than 30,000. Next slide. So then we get into when you're ready, when the study comes out, it's positive, it looks good, it looks like there's, from the evidence available, signs of treatment benefit and an adequate safety profile. Then at that point, a sponsor, usually, I've worked with a couple patient organizations. There was a patient organization called LAM, which I helped, just like PSC partners, their condition LAM is a lung disease that hits young women. And unless they get a lung transplant, they'll usually die in their 20s or 30s. So, and it was the LAM Foundation that I helped get approval of a treatment for their condition. So sometimes most of the time it's sponsors, 99% of the time. A drug company will come to the FDA with what's called a marketing application. It's either an NDA or a BLA. That doesn't matter, the names of these things. Next slide. And then when the FDA then reviews all this data, and sometimes you'll see the last bullet, they have an advisory committee. That's what happened today with this rare kidney disease. And so the FDA is going to look to see whether or not there's effectiveness. The legal standard was set in 1962, substantial evidence of effectiveness. And then it was earlier law set the safety assessment, 1932. But the safety, let me say it this way. You can look at whether or not there's treatment benefit independent of safety. Because you can look to see whether or not there's evidence that it's really helping somebody in how they feel or function, or maybe even survive. But safety, you can't look at safety independent of benefit, because even water isn't inherently safe. I mean, people drown every day. I mean, nothing is inherently safe. So safety always has to be evaluated in context of the quantity of benefit. So it's always a risk benefit. You'll hear that phrase. There's a risk benefit that has to be done. And of course, the last bullet in that list is manufacturing. You have to prove that you can, reproducibly, consistently manufacture a product so that it's going to have the same product attributes, over time. Each time you make it from lot to lot, there's consistency. Next slide. And then after a drug is approved, it's not the end of the story, that the FDA continues to monitor and what they call post-market safety surveillance. I've never really liked that phrase post-market, by the way. One of my degrees is in law. So, we play with words, lawyers. And it's like post-market. Does that mean beyond market? No, it's in the market. It should be post-approval safety surveillance, but never mind. That once it's approved and it's available to you and your doctors can prescribe it for you, the FDA doesn't go away. The FDA continues to monitor the safety. They rely upon reports, and they also have other systems. There's a system now at the FDA called the Sentinel system, which watches for any kind of new sign of an emerging safety signal so that they can either modify the labeling or come up with some risk mitigation measures to better ensure patient safety, or maybe contraindicate it for certain, or give special warnings to protect patients. So the FDA's role doesn't stop at the time at which they allow a product to be made available to you patients. So next slide, please. So what exactly then does the FDA do? So the next slide. Well, I just want to make sure, I've been talking a lot about the FDA. I was at the FDA in the early to mid 80s. I was a youngster. I was 6 or 7 years old. And so I was there, and it turns out I still love the FDA, but the FDA doesn't develop drugs. That's, academics, industry, sometimes patient organizations, but it's others. Sometimes they have some government support, like NIH might be able to give grants to support researchers, but it's going to be these organizations, not the FDA, that does this. And then the FDA doesn't test the drugs. The FDA isn't around. It does give permission for the studies to go forward. And the FDA is kind of like a safety watchdog, making sure that things are going along the right way and patients are being protected. But other than that, it's really the initiative, the requirement for going forward is in the hands of others. It's in the hands of researchers and industry, and sometimes even nonprofit groups like PSC. Next slide. The other thing that you should understand is that while the FDA does regulate some parts of your medicines, there are some parts it can't touch. One thing that's very important to understand is they can't touch off-label use. So if you happen to be, I helped get ursodiol, approved for urea cycle disorders a long time ago, probably about 1990. And it's now used sometimes off-label for PSC, vancomycin, rifampin, cholestyramine. There are drugs that are not approved by the FDA for use in PSC, but nevertheless, it's part of the practice of medicine. And that's regulated by each state. And so really the FDA isn't involved. Once a drug is made available, that's up to the practice of medicine to be able to apply it to patients. And the other thing that the FDA doesn't get involved with is the price of medicines. So, you know, don't blame the FDA for the high cost of your medicines or your copays for your medicines. You know, FDA can't consider, it legally has no authority under law to look at the price. So that's a consideration that is not part of the FDA's kind of armamentarium. It's not something they can look at. So what does the FDA do? Next slide, please. So the FDA then is to promote the public health. And so the FDA reviewers have expert knowledge on how to develop drugs and how to run clinical trials, and they provide technical advice, even though they always say they're not a consultant to researchers or industry, but nevertheless, they provide advice and they help in the design, and they meet often, you know, with companies throughout the whole process. Next slide. So if you want more information, there's a web page that the FDA has that's been specially adapted for patients so that, you know, kind of walks you through it. So if you have questions about any of these first 15 or so slides, you know, you might want to go to that portal. Now I'm going to turn, now I'm going to turn to your role. And next slide, please. So I want to show you that I think about 15 years ago, I was invited with Francis Collins, the head of NIH, and Janet Woodcock, the head of the Center for Drugs, and I were the three people invited to a very fancy resort to be on a weekend retreat with the vice presidents for the pharma companies, the biggest drug companies. And we were the three outside guests, and each of us were invited to give a talk. And I gave a talk 15 years ago that said, pay attention to the rising voice of the patient. And I've been a major proponent of having patient-centered drug development for many decades. And so I'm really pleased with where we've come. This is adapted from the Parkinson's Disease Foundation and their materials. And by the way, you'll notice already, I don't talk about everything that's on my slide, because if I talked about every line that's on this slide, we'd be here till tomorrow morning, or Joanne, Nancy, Ruth Ann would kick me off. So I gave you more materials in my slides, and I hope that PSC partners will make them available on their website so that you can kind of look at them more carefully some other time, because this lists a lot of the different ways that you can be involved. For instance, you know, look in the brown, the right-hand, lower right-hand corner, the brown box. It says provide testimony at the FDA hearings. At today's advisory committee, there was about an hour of patient testimony. And each of the panel members who were then voting on this drug, each of them complimented, you know, the patient testimony and how important the input was on this. I'm going to talk about that more later on. Next slide. So patients who live with the disease have a direct stake in the outcome of FDA's decisions, are in a unique position to contribute to the understanding of their disease. This is, next slide, please. I mean, I want to tell you that we are in a, next slide, please. We're in a fundamentally different world today, almost than when I started working at the FDA in 1983. In 1906 was the first US kind of federal drug law, 1906. It took until 2016, almost the last piece of legislation that President Obama signed in his term, and 2 terms, was December 2016. It was a 21st Century Cures Act. I had the privilege of being the first of the 5 people who testified in favor of that law back in May 2014. And that's the first time in December 2016 that the word patient appeared in our US, you know, drug laws. From 1906 to 2016, over 100 years, 110 years, the word patient never appeared in our drug laws. What are drugs about but to help patients? How could we ignore even having the word patient in our laws? It's perplexing to me, but it reflects a certain paternalism. It was like, patients don't have a role. It's something that the drug drug industry together with academia, would kind of come up with solutions for patients. And then through the FDA government approval, it would then be delivered unto patients, but patients didn't have a seat at the table. That's a type of paternalism I've been railing against, for a long time. And I put this little chart together. Again, I'm not going to go through it, but you can just walk through the process from the lower left, which is, I talk about the AIDS crisis. I was at the FDA during the AIDS crisis, and there was a time in which the patient activists like ACT UP and AMFAR really, really made their voices known, and FDA changed. I was at FDA and I was part of the change because of the patient voice. At the same time, or actually a little bit earlier, rare disease patients had mobilized, even before HIV or AIDS patients had mobilized. They were led by a grandmother from Connecticut. That's how she describes herself, Abby Myers, two boys with Tourette's, and a woman, Marjorie Guthrie, who was the widow of Woody Guthrie. Ask your grandparents about Woody Guthrie. He was a folk singer from the 60s. He died of Huntington's disease. The two of them marched on Washington with other rare disease patients, and they created the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, signed by President Reagan. And so it showed the power of the patient voice. And this is an illustration of, again, of how the rising power of the patient voice within FDA. Next slide, please. Oh, with it, this is, I guess I jumped the gun. This is that law from Obama that was signed into law, the 21st Century Cures Act. I should have put in a little slide of me testifying in May 2014 before the Congress and speaking in favor of it. But you see, what it did is it required the FDA, as part of every review of every new medicine, to include an explanation of patient experience, that it's supposed to collect information about the patient experience with a disease or condition, including related to the impact of the disease on patients' lives and patient preferences with respect to treatment. And this is all supposed to be included in every FDA review of every new medicine. This is groundbreaking. It was 2016. Remember, the word patient didn't appear in the law until 2016. And now the FDA is going to be required to follow it, to expect that from researchers and from sponsors, drug industry. So this is a sea change, really, really remarkable, showing how responsive we as a society are to you patients, like in the PSC partners. So next slide, please. So patient input can come in product-specific ways by being a FDA patient representative, you can be that, by talking about your experiences in studies. You can appear like many patients, I think 20 of them, appeared today at the FDA Advisory Committee, or you can just talk about the context, not a specific product, but just the context of your experience, like a patient-focused drug development meeting or a listening session with the FDA. I'll talk a little bit about those. Responding to surveys, participating in FDA meetings. I didn't put on here, but responding to guidance documents. The FDA is always coming out with guidance documents, and you as patients can respond to those guidance and try to influence what the FDA is going to be requiring, because you want it to be more specific for you and more tailored to you. So next slide. I've got 6 more minutes. All right, next slide. So this is one of the things that's very important, is that the FDA always wants to know how is a researcher or industry, how are they measuring how a patient feels or functions? And you can do that by measuring performance, like 6-minute walk, by doing something that's clinician reported, or something that's observer reported, like a caregiver of a patient, let's say in an Alzheimer's disease condition. So the person's not able to report themselves, or somebody who has a psychiatric condition, or somebody who's a child, and so they can't report themselves, or patient reported. And so these kind of clinical outcome assessment tools are really important. I I saw that there was a representative from Mirum. Congratulations, on your approval for Alagille, which is a very serious liver disease. I had the privilege of being involved a little bit, helping you. And one of the key things there from that experience is that the FDA was saying this is in children, and yet the major symptom, how it affects how a patient feels or functions, is itching. And yet children can't really report how badly they itch, And so we had to work, Mirum, the sponsor, and I was helping them, had to convince the FDA that an observer, a parent, could really report on the severity of the itch in their child. They know. So that was kind of like a mind shift for the FDA. So, what am I saying? I'm using it as an illustration to show how important these measures are. That was the major basis for the FDA approving Livmarli, the drug that just got approved for Alagille earlier this fall. So these are very important instruments, and you have a very important role. Next slide. So how do we know if it's clinically meaningful? There was a drug that was approved, and I was helping it for a drug called Northera, droxidopa, for orthostatic hypotension, a rare condition where people, they can't change position. If they're sitting down and they stand up, they might fall over because they'd be so dizzy. Or getting up out of bed is a real problem. They have to sleep on an incline. Really difficult for these people to get through their daily life. So dizziness is their number one symptom. But how much, if you have a scale of 0 to 10 dizziness, how much do you have to move the needle in order on that scale for it to be meaningful to a person? What I try to explain to the FDA that should be individually determined and not for the whole community. It shouldn't be everybody with orthostatic hypotension has the same amount that they have to be moved for it to be meaningful. And the example I would give is I said, I'm a fat, old, lazy lawyer. For me to be meaningful, it'd have to move on a scale of 0 to 10, probably 2 or 3 points, maybe 4 points. But let's say my daughter, who's a professional dancer, it might have to move 1/10 of 1 point for it to be meaningful, because that's going to be the difference between her keeping her job as a dancer and not. So clinically meaningfulness, it depends upon you, the patient. So your voice is very important. Next paragraph, next slide, sorry. A good example of this, boy, this is a great story. I have great stories on all of this stuff, but I can't. This is a good story of patience. I got a Lifetime Achievement Award from an organization that represents people with a rare skin disease called epidermolysa bullosa. It causes lesions all over their bodies, and children then have to have their bandages, they almost look like mummies, have to have them changed every day, and their parents have to peel them off, and they've been dried off because there's been exudate. It's really painful. So when I went to this awards and I heard that FDA was demanding that companies meet what's called an investigator global assessment, meaning an investigator looking at it on a scale of 0 to 5, in order for the drug to be effective, they had to get a patient to 0 or 1, meaning clear, their skin was clear, or 1, nearly clear. I went to the FDA the day after I went to this award ceremony and called the FDA and said, this is wrong. That standard might be right for acne and psoriasis, but it's not right. I sat between 2 girls, 11, 12-year-old girls. I'm a devout Catholic. If I took them to Lourdes, they are not going to get to 0 or 1. And so the FDA, God bless them, the FDA held. That was December 2017. The FDA said, Frank, what are we going to do? They said, let's have a patient listening session. This is the head of the FDA dermatology division. And on there, after they listened to patients speak that day, the next month in May 2018, they came out, next slide, they came out with their own guidance document on their own. And what's amazing is that we didn't even ask them to do this. It shows a publication date of June, but it actually issued in May. And what's amazing is they didn't require the IGA to be used. That's why I highlighted the efficacy endpoints. So the FDA listens, but it listens to you and it changes. And that's why your voice is so important in the process. So I'm about out of time.
Hi, Frank. This is Ruth Ann. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
We're happy to give you another 5 minutes. We love our breakout rooms, but we only have one
Okay.
night with you.
All right. So, all right, let's move ahead a couple slides. I'm going to go to Tiffany House. There's a picture of a young woman who has Pompe disease. There, that slide. This is the first rare disease day that the FDA ever held. It was 2012. I was chairman of NORD, the patient organization. We started this idea of having rare disease day. The end of February, we said every 4 years, February 29th, that's a rare day, it's leap year. So we said we're gonna make that. 2012, the FDA held its first ever rare disease day. This was the first panel of speakers at the rare disease day. The guy with the red tie, that's me. But also on the panel was Tiffany House, a woman with Pompe. Here's what she did. As a patient, she got embedded into the FDA review team as a patient. And in that process, she helped the drug get approved for Myozyme. And it turns out for treating Pompe. And when I asked her, and her story is, the big thing that she did to teach the FDA is that for a therapy to be effective for a person who has a disease that is unilaterally progressive, that is, you're going to constantly be deteriorating, you're never going to improve. Your best day is the day you're diagnosed, and from then on, it's going to get worse. For that person to be stable is a huge benefit. And she taught the FDA reviewers that. It was like an epiphany to them. You're like, what? We don't have to show an improvement? It's good to be stable? Yes. All right, next slide. So I think that this benefit risk ratio that I talked about earlier, that's really important because there's always going to be some risk, but it's how big is the benefit. So I'm going to kind of skip through, go to the next slide. You know, I just want to give you an idea that for you, thinking about the therapeutic context, how do you get to the risk benefit? This is all dependent upon you. It's what is important to you? How much risk are you willing to accept? How much uncertainty of benefit are you willing to accept? How does this affect your activities of daily living? You know, being able for you to express these things is really important. And I want to give you an example of that. I have that embedded in here. Two more slides. There's a slide that says Huntington's disease. Yeah, I went to this meeting that the FDA held on Huntington's disease. And it was so funny. The patient organization, the Huntington's Disease Society of America, stood up and said they did a survey of 200 neurologists who treat Huntington's and 200 patients with Huntington's. And they said, what's the most important thing that you have to treat? The patients, first I'll talk about the doctors. The neurologists said the two most important things are chorea, which is shaking, and slurred speech. Those are the two most important things. Our therapies, new therapies, have to treat this because this is really bad for patients. Patients, that was like number 5 and 7 in their top list. They said, if people have a problem with me twitching, that's their problem. I'm okay with that. You know, I mean, it's a problem, but it's not their top problem like neurologists thought. And slurred speech, people will have to understand how I speak. Their top problems with the ability to perform activities of daily living. The most important thing is for me to be able to go to school. It's for me to be able to hold a job. Do you see how the whole process of developing medicines from 1906 to 2016 was skewed because we were relying upon other people, not patients, to figure out what it is that patients need and how much risk they're willing to take and how much benefit and what kind of benefit they want? This was wrong. And so we're reviving it. But the only way we can change it is with your input. So I just want to, in closing, Go to a slide, because my numbers are different than yours. FDA endorses patient voice. It's about 4 slides. There it is. Thank you very much. Who's ever working the slides, you're doing a wonderful job. So the FDA came out with a guidance document in December 2019, and it said, look, we want to understand how much uncertainty a patient is willing to have. Well, you might have heard that the FDA approved a drug for Alzheimer's disease in December. It's very controversial, biasing drug called Aduhelm. The FDA senior drug officials wrote an editorial in the New England Journal or the Journal of the American Medical Association, I forget which. They wrote a combined editorial that said, you know what convinced us? We went to a listening session with Alzheimer's patients, and they told us this is such a bad disease. They're willing to accept more uncertainty about the magnitude of treatment benefit, and factoring that in to the amount of evidence we had gave us the confidence that we could approve this drug. Very controversial. But again, the FDA, think about that. Think about that. That's 2021, right? We've had these drug laws since 1906. 2016, they finally insert the word patient. And here's the FDA making a very controversial statement and making very public that the reason why they were able to make this decision, because of you, the patients. That's how important you are. Next slide. Here are 2 examples of where my firm has been involved with drugs for ALS and for Barr syndrome, and we help the patients in both cases. The ALS Association and the Barr Syndrome Foundation both understand the data to such an extent that they were able to write to the FDA and persuade the FDA on these. In the case of a drug for ALS, Amylyx drug, that the FDA kind of reversed itself. It had told Amylyx, you don't have enough data, don't come in. After the patient association went to the FDA and said, now wait a minute, the FDA reversed itself and said, okay, come on in with an application. So that's what's going on right now. Again, that's you. That's the patient voice. Next slide. Here is an example that even after the first drug is approved, I helped get the first drug approved for spinal muscular atrophy. What is that? In babies, it's called the floppy baby. A baby born with type 1 SMA is never going to roll over, never going to be able to sit up. And I helped the first drug to get approved. It was in December 23rd, 2016. When I called Janet Woodcock, the head of the Center for Drugs, in August, when I helped unblind the data and I saw the data, I cried. It was so spectacular. And I told Dr. Woodcock, get your best reviewers. It can be the fastest drug approval in history. And guess what? From the time that we submitted it, it was like 93 days. It was the fastest and still is the fastest FDA drug approval ever. But after that drug got approved, then the FDA, the patient organization, Cure SMA, held a patient-focused drug development meeting, just like you had in October, of last year, 2020. They had one in 2017, and they said, we still need more. And that helped set the context for another drug I helped get approved, which was the first systemic gene therapy, Zolgensma, for SMA. When I gave a talk at the Vatican in May 2019, and I showed a slide of little Matteo. Now, a person with type 1 SMA is never supposed to be able to sit up. They're never supposed to roll over. And they die at 10 to 14 months old. I showed a video at the Vatican of little Matteo at age 3 walking down the hall of Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, at age 3 and standing on tiptoes and pressing the up elevator. Francis Collins was in the first row and he cried. Because here's a man who devoted his life to cracking the genome code. And now he's seeing all his work paid off. He's seeing it. So that's because of you, the patients, again, getting involved. And so I just want to emphasize that whenever you think that you're not important, you are. You are. And go to the slide with the Pope, since I mentioned the Vatican. There's 2 slides away. There you go. So the Pope this year gave me an award for my work. And I'm explaining to the Pope, this is going to involve you in a second. I was explaining to the Pope how I had helped get a drug, benznidazole, approved for Chagas. Chagas is this disease that spread usually by a bug who lives on the walls of mud huts of the poor in South America. And the bug bites usually a child and transmits a pathogen, and it travels to the heart muscle and sits there and eats away at the heart muscle, maybe for 20 years. The person doesn't know they're infected, and then they suddenly die. It kills Chagas, kills more in the Pope's native Argentina than malaria. So the Pope was very interested in my story. And when I got done, I asked the Pope for a special blessing on all of our sisters and brothers who are affected with rare diseases, and on all of those researchers and drug sponsors and everyone in industry and government who helps on therapies for our sisters and brothers affected with rare diseases. And the Pope gave me that special blessing. And so you didn't know it till now, but each of you has a special blessing from Pope Francis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you for sharing that story and for such a moving, educational, and inspirational presentation tonight. I think I can speak for everyone here and in the PSC community in saying that we are just so appreciative of your support and for joining us here tonight for this really important discussion. I just have a few quick notes before we all depart for the night. I hope you all had a great time in the breakout rooms. So just a few updates. Please save the date for the PSC Partners Conference from June 2nd to 5th, 2022. And please support our end of year campaign. We kicked off our end of year fundraising campaign, and PSC Partners would love your support in our search for treatments and a cure for PSC. Click the link on the homepage of our website to donate. Please also consider joining the Patient Registry and Mentor Program. We had questions about this in the breakout room today, and we'll be sending out more information about it. We're in need of mentors for a year-round peer-to-peer support program. If you have attended at least one PSC Partners conference and want to give back to the community, you can be a mentor and make a big impact in someone's life. All it takes is a caring heart and a willing ear. Please visit the mentor page on our website for more information. And while you're there, you'll find updated COVID-19 and vaccine information and links to listen to our monthly Living with PSC podcast with Niall. If you're not receiving our monthly newsletter and other vital emails, please sign up on our mailing list to stay up to date on all the PSC news and PSC Partners happenings. So last, a few upcoming events to highlight. Future Zoom rooms will take place from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Mountain Time, beginning with teens aged 13 to 20 on December 14th, Tuesday. A Zoom room for those coping with loss will be held on Wednesday, December 15th. And to start the new year, PSC adults 18 plus will meet on Wednesday, January 5th. And last but not least, PSC Partners Canada is hosting a New Year virtual meetup on GatherTown on Thursday, January 30th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time.
Correction, December 30.
December 30th.
Sorry.
This year. Got it. December 30th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Please visit PSC Partners Canada and sign up for a mailing list and follow us on social media to learn more. Thanks. So just before we go, I want to switch pace to briefly summarize how far we've all come together through the Roadmap Initiative. Whether you've been here for just this webinar or you've been here from the very beginning, we're so glad that you've joined us. Over these meetings, we welcomed more than 300 unique participants. So thank you so much for being a part of this mighty community. You've all voiced dozens of research questions, and we've been collecting them all. We've also built some existing and exciting relationships with clinicians and researchers, and we look forward to keeping the momentum going during the annual conference next year. Because this is just the beginning. PSC Partners will prioritize PSC patient needs in developing a strategic research plan and launching the PSC Partners International Collaborative Research Network at the 2022 PSC Partners Conference. Next slide, please. And last, a link to the survey will be emailed to you shortly, but you can also follow this link or scan the QR code on this slide. Please also send in questions you didn't have a chance to ask tonight. Your feedback will also help us to prepare for the next roadmap series, Drug Development 201. Please keep an eye out in our monthly newsletter, social media pages, and website for communications with more details. We hope to see you all at the Roadmap Drug Development 201 on Tuesday, January 11th. Have a great night, everyone.